All right, we're back. Welcome those of you who are starting in just with the red wines. And let's move along. We're going to be practicing, again, the 4-step tasting method. And I want you to try your best to pull back those opinions about these wines and push forward our observation, because we are adding 2 more additional layers of complexity to the scene. And that's the addition of tannin in red wines and terroir, which is associated with old world wine regions, starting with this wine right here. This is the GSM/Rhône blend. GSM stands for Grenache, Syrah, Mourvèdre. My wine has some Carignan in it too. That's another really common grape that grows down in the southern parts of France in the Rhône and Languedoc-Roussillon. You can also find this blend in Spain. All right, so jumping right into the tasting here. Open your booklet to the tasting page for red wines with the red wine color chart, and let's take a look assessment of this wine. So taking that glass, holding it over the color or a white sheet of paper to get a good assessment of the color, we're looking to see if this is a purple tinted wine, a ruby tinted wine, or a garnet tinted wine. When you look at the color, which one of these colors does it line up the most to? Mine is actually right smack dab in the middle at ruby. Now, intensity of color. Can you see through the wine? If you hold your hand under the glass, can you see through the wine? That is, if you can't, it's deep. If you can, maybe sort of kind of a little bit, that's medium. And if you absolutely can see through the wine, that is pale. Take a look at Pinot next time and see what you see. Okay, so this wine, my wine, is a deep ruby color. I can't see through it. It's absolutely dark. And that is all we need to do for color. Bam! So let's swirl the wine really quick and take a look at the viscosity. Wines at room temperature do form legs a lot more quickly, and red wines do definitely form those tears on the side of the glass, and we can see that viscosity forming here. I would say it's moderate plus viscosity, and that's true. This wine happens to be 14% alcohol. Now remember, when you're looking at legs, you're not really making an accurate assessment of wine, because every single room has different humidity levels, the temperature of wine is different, but when you compare wines with one another, that's when we start seeing the magic. So this is all we really need to do for this assessment, and we're done with look. How cool is that? Okay, now we want to start sniffing the wine. And I said this before to the white wine folks who went through the white wine tasting with me, but this is hard. It's not easy to do. The first thing you want to do is, though, it's to take a quick assessment of the intensity of aromas that are coming out of the glass. So you'll dive in, take a quick whiff, and move away. What did you think? Was there a lot of fruit and flavors and stuff coming out of the glass? Or was it kind of not very available? Was it closed? I don't know about you guys, but my wine is well decanted and it is just popping. It is high intensity over here. If you have a Grenache-based wine, it should be moderately high intensity as well. The next thing I'm going to do is try to pick out individual flavors. And we have our flavor chart right here, like a micro one to look at. But if you need extra help, do turn to the page on Rhône GSM blends, and you'll see a lot of common flavors associated with this particular wine. And again, my method is to go into the glass, pull a flavor, and think about it for a minute or two. So if you want to pause me, take a moment to write down and notate the smells that you get out of this wine. And your goal, again, is to get 3 fruit aromas and 3 other than fruit aromas coming out of the glass right here. All right, let's do this. Okay, starting with these aroma categories right here. I'm looking at dried fruits. And to me, this wine smells very juicy and very fresh, and I don't get a lot of dried fruit notes. So I might move along to the next category of red fruits and black fruits and see what I find in there. What's interesting about this wine to me, and what I'm smelling right here, is sort of a combination. And this is really common when you have blended wines, where you get not only just red fruit flavors, you also get dark fruit flavors. And to me, I get this really remarkable, noticeable blend between raspberries, sort of fresh, juicy raspberries, and blueberries in this wine. They're juicy, they're kind of punchy smelling fruits, but they're both red and black fruits. Do we get any flower smells in this wine? To me, I could call out maybe a slight note of lavender, but it isn't very strong. To me, this wine is very fruity, it's very punchy, but there is something noticeable about this wine that's starting to reveal itself in these aromatics. And that is this subtle earthiness that is coming through in the wine. If you really dig your nose into the glass here and take a big whiff, you start to imagining things like terracotta pots, or maybe like walking around a farmyard, running into some farm animals. We've got some funky aromas in this glass that are very not fruit-like in their character. And now we're getting into this concept of what is the terroir of this wine right here, with the earth notes coming through. Finally, we're going to take a whiff and check to see if we can find out any oak flavors. And to me, there are not super strong aromas of allspice, clove, cola, vanilla, that sort of thing, baking spices that you get from oak aging. And it's not very present in this wine. So for me, in my perspective, I don't get a whole lot of oak. They certainly may have used oak in the aging of this wine, but perhaps these were like well-used barrels that don't imbue as much flavor. So there we go. Smell assessment from my perspective, and let's move on to the taste part. Okay, we're tasting the wine. A lot of things are gonna happen really fast. So you're gonna take a big swig, you're gonna swish it around your palate, and you're really gonna feel it more than you're gonna taste it. We're gonna feel, is it sweet or is it dry? Then we're gonna feel that acidity come in the palate, that tartness. Then we're gonna feel tannin. We're gonna touch our tongue to the roof of the mouth, and we're gonna, or all around our palate, and try to look for this grippy, astringent sensation. That grippiness, that bitterness that you taste in wine is the tannin, and some people don't like it, but you might as well, because it's the only thing in wine that's good for you. So let's dig in to that tannin. And then finally on the finish, we are gonna sort of match the finish of the flavor with the front of the flavor. We're going to think about the overall balance and how those structural characteristics of acidity, alcohol level, tannin all match up with one another. All right, you're ready to do this? Let's do it. Take a moment. Feel how this wine evolves on your palate in the aftertaste. Still on my palate at least. That was about 15 seconds of evolution, really obvious evolution on my palate, and that's essentially the length of the wine. And now I'm reflecting on what I tasted. Rub that tongue to the roof of your mouth. Do you feel tannin? There is a slightly grippy sensation. There is some bitterness sort of hanging out on the sides of my tongue here, but it's not super astringent. So when I take an assessment of tannin in this wine, I would say it's moderately low. It's not that high tannin. Now, acidity-wise, we felt that acidity right in the front. Did you feel that sort of sparkle of acidity come through? But then, towards the finish, I'm left with this sort of sweet fruit and oiliness on my palate, which is probably from that malolactic fermentation. I'll talk about that in a moment. Left in the wine with that sort of creaminess on the palate. So acidity-wise, I don't know that this is a high or even medium-high acid wine. Maybe it's in the medium to slightly less realm. So 3.5 pH and above in the acidity realm. Still, it's juicy on my palate, so there is definitely some there, but that's my assessment of the acidity level of this wine so far. And then finally, let's think about that overall balance. How did it end from start to finish? How did that alcohol feel, that burn of alcohol in the back of your throat, compare with the front of the taste? Okay, that was a lot. Let's take another sip and see if we can think about those things while we're tasting it this time. To me, this is a well-balanced wine. It has this juicy fruitiness up front. It doesn't have super high tannins, but on the finish, it comes up with some oiliness, some richness in the palate, and then it has some sweet fruit on the finish, almost like dried fruit characteristics. And that, as a profile of wine, is a very nice thing, easy thing to drink, which is one of the reasons why this blend is such a great blend to find and try. So I mentioned this thing called MLF, and I know we talked about it earlier with the white wines, but red wine folks, you might want to know about it. Most red wines go through this process after the fermentation called malolactic fermentation. It usually happens in tanks or in barrels when wine's aging in barrels, and that is when this little microbe comes in and he eats the acid in the wine, and then he poops out a different kind of acid. He eats the malic acid, he poops out lactic acid, thus malolactic fermentation, and that's what makes the wine have a little bit of a creamy palate towards the end of the taste. It's very common in red wines, and you'll find it in white wines, and if you're thinking it might be Chardonnay, you would be right. An oaked Chardonnay often has a little bit of malolactic fermentation. And that creaminess is very desirable in red wines. It adds body, it adds complexity in the palate, and it's actually a part of the winemaking in this wine. It's what, beyond the grape variety, it's the winemaking that produces these flavors in wine. And one of the reasons why tasting wine is so difficult to do is because there's so much going on in the glass. So let's talk about this blend a little bit more and why it's so interesting. Grenache Syrah and Mourvèdre is not, despite how prolific this wine is, it's not super well known by the public. Most of us just know Cabernet Sauvignon, so we ask for Cabernet Sauvignon, but this great blend has a super long history in southern France and northern Spain, and has been spread in warmer climate regions. These grapes do well with lots of sun, and so you'll find it in places like California and around Paso Robles. You'll find it in Australia. South Australia actually specializes in Shiraz, aka Syrah, but they also have Grenache and Mourvèdre, albeit they call it Mataro there sometimes. And so they'll make these amazing blends. South Africa is another great example of where you can find these wines. But we're looking at a warmer climate that produces super fruity red varieties, and singularly on their own, if you taste Grenache, it's super fruity and juicy, and sometimes needs a little bit of something richer to balance that fruitiness. So that's why Syrah and Mourvèdre get thrown into the blend. And it's really the winemaker's skill and what they have planted in the vineyard that makes these blends so special. And it's one of the reasons why it's so exciting to find your favorite producer here, because they'll have a totally different methodology for what they blend and why. So this is awesome. This is really cool. My wine, I want to tell you a little bit about my wine. It did spend some time in oak barrels, albeit I bet most of them were used barrels, which is why we didn't get a lot of oak notes, flavors on this wine. Another thing I want to mention about this wine is the winemaking method. Beyond that talk about MLF, which we mentioned, this wine was actually produced using a winemaking method called carbonic maceration. It's when the winemaker takes the grapes, throws all the grape bunches into a tank, closes the lid, and then waits. The weight of all those berries on top of each other crushes the ones on the bottom, and that juice starts to ferment, which creates a yeast population in this tank, and you get internal berry fermentations that happen before the grapes even smush and explode. And what that does is it actually causes the wine to have slightly lighter tannin. And if you can remember tasting this wine, it didn't feel like it had a whole lot of tannin. In fact, it was super fruity. And this is one of those qualities you'll find in wines made with carbonic maceration. If you're keen on a wine such as this, it's a great wine for pairing with just about all food because the tannin is so light. But take a note of the winemaking strategy. If you can find a note about how the wine was made, carbonic maceration is a specific style that you can find out there in the world and enjoy delicious fruity wines such as this one. Okay, I'm going to move on. We're going to start comparing wines. So leave this glass here and fill up your next wine, the Sangiovese.